Have you tried GitHub's new MCP server? MCP is an open protocol that enables AI models to connect to tools and data in the GitHub ecosystem. This is GitHub's official open source MCP server. It's like giving your AI assistant superpowers all from inside VS Code. Let's look at what you can do with GitHub's MCP. You can automate GitHub workflows and processes like triggering actions and managing issues right from chat. You can extract and analyze GitHub repository data using tools like code scanning and repo metadata to generate insights instantly. You can also build your own AI-powered tools to interact with GitHub, creating custom extensions to connect with GitHub's API and integrate them right into your developer workflows. Setting it up is incredibly simple. Let me walk you through it. This is going to be for VS Code. First, make sure you have the latest version of VS Code installed. Then, head to gh.io/ncp. That repo contains all the code and documentation for the MCP server. Don't forget to leave a star. Then you can scroll down to the README and you can see this one-click option here to install for VS Code or VS Code Insiders. We'll select VS Code. That is going to automatically open our editor. Here we can see the preset configuration and make changes to update with my own token. And I need to make sure that we have agent mode enabled on chat. Once that's done, you can interact directly in the GitHub Copilot box by selecting agent mode. This is going to allow Copilot to access and use GitHub's MCP server tools. Now you're ready to interact through natural language. You can ask things like get me, which is going to show you a brief overview of the authenticated user. You can even give tasks like I just did. I want to create a new repo called MCP tips and even create the content that's going to go inside that README. I quickly specify what I want. And once that's done, the MCP server goes to work for me. With GitHub's MCP server, you are enabling a new class of AI-powered tooling. Whether for automating workflows or using insights from repos, it's all open source, developer first, and ready to be extended. It works seamlessly with VS Code agent mode. Plus, you can use it with any tool that supports the Model Context Protocol. Try it out, start the repo, and let us know what you're building with GitHub's MCP server. Microsoft Build is coming to Seattle May 19th through the 22nd, and I will be there, the GitHub team will be there, and we're bringing the goods. We're gonna feature the Copilot prize wheel, we have surprise product demos, and we'll be bringing this ultimate vibe coding keyword. Oh, that's what that is. So that is the button for the prize wheel. Okay, this conference is gonna shape up to be a perfect mix of learning and fun with plenty of opportunities for you to talk to GitHubbers as well as watch live demos and explore the latest in developer tools and technologies. I hope to see you there. Mark your calendars. This is one dev conference you don't wanna miss. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Thank you for being here. Happy Friday, friends. We made it. And welcome to the month of May. I think last time I saw you, we were in April. So the month of May is a very special month around GitHub because it is Maintainer Month. And in case you're new here, this is going to be a special edition of Open Source Friday. Today, we're actually having 2 streams, and this is in honor of Maintainer Month. I'm super excited about this guest that I have for you today. But in case that you're wondering what Maintainer Month is, it's a month that we use to celebrate the maintainers, the projects, and it come together as a community. There is a list of exclusive events that members of our maintainer community are invited to. And those events include communications with the product people at GitHub. You get to see what's coming up. But the best part is you get to network with maintainers and you get to share your experiences and just learn and grow from each other. So if you're not part of the maintainer community at GitHub yet, I am going to share the place where you can join so that you can go ahead and become a part of this community. And if you know a open source maintainer that should be there, please share the link with them as well. So because it's maintainer month and we gotta have a little extra, we have a super special guest today and a topic that is incredibly relevant to everyone. Whether you are a open source consumer, contributor, maintainer, you're thinking about investing on an open source project, be it your time or actually thinking about building a company atop an open source project, this talk is for you. There is so much information out there, a lot of misinformation as well when we're talking about financial issues, open source sustainability. We're talking about what's going to power the future of software that depends so highly on people like you, who are just awesome people in the community, who either there is a project that piques your technical interest, or you're always up for a challenge, or you truly care for the community and you want to make sure that your favorite project continues to thrive. But who pays for this? That is the topic of our workshop/talk today. And I have the honor of bringing you an expert in this field. I'm going to give him a proper intro and then we'll bring him up. But my guest today is Shaun Walker. Shaun actually was with us about 4 weeks ago, and we talked about his company Octane, which is a company for you .NET developers. Check it out. I will share all those links as well in a little bit. But Shaun is the original creator of Octane and also the .NET Nuke project. These are web application frameworks that are very well known amongst pioneering really and like widely adopted open source projects native to the Microsoft platform. Shaun was doing Microsoft open source before it was as mainstream as it is. So it's incredible. He's got an incredible trajectory, a long career, and significant community contributions that have earned him titles of MVP. I think he's been a running MVP for over 15 years, chair of the project committee for the .NET Foundation, and raised multiple rounds of venture capital with top Silicon Valley firms. In 2011, he was recognized as lead entrepreneur in the VIB 40 Under 40 Business Awards. And he's now the founder of Essence as well. He served as CTO of companies with massive 200 million year professional service portfolios. And he's been there, done that, has long contributed to open source. And we're just so thrilled to have his expertise here today. So if you have questions, this is your chance. Welcome, Shaun. Thank you for being back at Open Source Friday, this special Maintainer Month edition. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on again. That was quite the intro. That was made me sound way more impressive than I actually am.
You are, first of all, and it is so incredible when we have someone that has the amazing trajectory, and not only in open source but also in business. Like, you managed to do something that a lot of us would love to do, right? Like, have that company that's growing and thriving, and then it's also contributing back to the open source ecosystem. So if there is anyone in the world that can talk about sustainability, I feel like you're definitely it. So thank you for coming by and sharing your expertise. I am going to share your screen, and then I will go ahead and give you the floor. Folks, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. Wilson is saying hi. I hope you can hear that barking too loud. I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor, but I'll be monitoring the chat. We're going to try and save questions towards the end. I do see there were a couple of questions already that had come in, and you folks are awesome. Thank you for doing that. Lubos, and then some folks from some companies actually have posted questions. Whatever you're watching, whether it be YouTube, LinkedIn, X, or Twitch, go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. Don't worry, I won't forget about you. But let's go ahead and give a warm welcome to Shaun in the chat, and go ahead, Shaun, the stage is all yours.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so the title for my session today is Who Pays for Open Source? And this is a bit of a rhetorical question in that there's not a single answer to this question. In fact, there's multiple answers to this question. And as we go through the content of this presentation and get closer to the end, I think it should become clear that like who actually does pay for open source. So I'm Shaun Walker, and I don't think I need to go much into this because Andrea did a great job of introducing me already. And yeah, so currently though, I am the maintainer of an open source project called Octane, the Octane framework, which is a Microsoft-based framework for developing applications on Blazor and .NET MAUI. Yeah, and previously, of course, I was also the original creator of .NET Nuke, which was a very popular open source project in the .NET ecosystem. I guess the reason why I feel like I'm somewhat qualified to talk about open source sustainability is I've had a long open source journey. So going back to 2001, so boy, that's kind of scary that it's almost 25 years ago, that I started the .NET Nuke open source project. Obviously created it as a hobby project like most open source projects. It grew very rapidly. Eventually had to create a company around it, which was DNN Corp. We raised venture capital around it. And then it kind of went through that whole journey in being involved with a venture capital backed open source company. After leaving DNN Corp, I kind of had a little bit of a break from open source. Became involved with the .NET Foundation as a volunteer. I've been volunteering with the foundation ever since. But then in 2018, created a new open source project. But on this journey, of course, I struggled with sustainability for my various open source efforts. Experimented with a lot of different business models, a lot of different ways to try and raise capital or generate revenue as part of open source. Obviously, some things worked for me, some things did not. But I'm happy to share all of the experience that I had along that journey. Because I feel that they could potentially help others who are struggling with sustainability for their open source projects. And so when we talk about sustainability, I mean, there is an actual definition for sustainability. And that definition is avoiding the depletion of resources in order to maintain an ecological balance. So when we're talking about sustainability in the context of open source, what exactly are those resources? Well, the resources are the contributors that are providing time and effort towards the open source project. And typically, in order for them to provide their time and effort, it requires some kind of a revenue model, right, which will provide them with the time and effort so that they can focus on making those contributions. And in order to do that, of course, you do need a business model. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first off, let's take a little bit of a step back and talk about open source from a little bit of a higher level to set the stage. So I think a lot of folks, when they think about open source, they think about it a little bit like a fairy tale. So, you know, a software developer has a really cool idea. They develop it on their own. They release it to the broader community. The project gets some adoption. If they're lucky, it starts, getting a lot of adoption and goes viral. A lot of other developers are really passionate and interested in this project, so they step forward and they volunteer to assist. Everyone lives happily ever after. I'm sorry to say that this is not the way that open source works. The reality of open source is, yes, a developer might have an interesting idea, and yes, their project might become very popular. However, what ends up happening more often than not is the consumers of that open source project just start demanding a lot of features. They start demanding support, and they put more and more pressure on that original developer who created the project. Not a lot of folks step up to help out, and eventually that software developer gets burned out. And this is the definition of, the problem around sustainability is maintainer burnout. And this is the reality in a lot of open source projects. Some more facts, I guess, to consider. 95% of people who use open source as consumers do not contribute back in any way to open source. And then if you break it down into looking at that 5% who actually do contribute, 95% of the contributions are done by only 5% of contributors. So if you look at this as an iceberg, right? So it's only those folks that are at the tip of the iceberg that do the bulk of the work in an open source project. There may be some other folks that are supporting them in some minor ways. And then there's a huge number of consumers that just use the open source project and, sort of demand new features and support and things like that. So through my efforts at the .NET Foundation and in reviewing the open source projects that are part of the foundation, most open source projects are dependent upon one or two contributors, which is obviously very risky because we sort of have this bus factor, meaning that if you lose a primary contributor of your open source project, then that often might result in the end of that open source project, because there is no succession planning or continuity planning in open source. Like there's no one standing in the wings, waiting to take over the project if the primary maintainer is no longer able to, right? And so these are some of the risks around open source. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this graph. It's like sort of the Gartner hype cycle graph. I've kind of adapted it here to open source and open source maintainers. And typically when an open source project is released by a maintainer, there's a lot of excitement. They're excited because they don't know initially if a lot of people are going to find value in their project. And if they're lucky enough that, it solves a problem that a lot of people need solving, then adoption happens quite quickly and they get quite excited. Like they're excited that there's validation for their work. And so that happens for a period of time. But eventually they sort of reach this peak, which is like the height of their excitement, because they start to realize, although I've released this and a lot of people are using it, it's going to result in a lot of work for me, because I'm going to have to keep maintaining this project and managing the community. And they start to lose that excitement. And they kind of drop down to what I call this trough of disillusionment, meaning they sometimes question why they even released the original open source project at all, because it's becoming such a burden on their life at this point. And then they'll try various things to try and maybe generate some revenue so that they are able to spend more money on the project, or they'll try to solicit more volunteers to help carry the load. And so this will result in like these waves of optimism where they'll get excited for a period of time because it might be working, but then, things don't quite work out the way they had hoped and they fall back down to this disillusionment again. And at some point, the open source project either reaches a plateau of sustainability, meaning there's sort of enough resources available that, that it's manageable for the maintainer, or they sink down to this abyss of martyrdom, meaning they just at that point feel like a victim sort of their own success, because a lot of people are getting great value out of the work that they're doing, but they are not directly seeing the value themselves. And so this is the quote, "Success is sometimes harder than failure," meaning like if you have an open source project and it doesn't get a lot of adoption, it's actually easier to manage because you don't have a whole lot of requests coming to you. But if your project becomes very successful, then the burden becomes very large on the original maintainers. There's a lot of sort of comics and things that have been created over time related to open source. These ones are like more, I think, maintainers sort of poking fun at themselves, because maybe a lot of folks think that being a maintainer of an open source project is a bit of a glamorous title, but it's not, because, you get a lot of, you get some credibility through doing it and maybe some boost in reputation, but you also get a lot of requests coming your way to basically do work for free for others. And this comic here, do you have a hobby and why is it spending all your time coding on open source software? So I think that kind of summarizes it, and I'm not sure what happened here. So this, I was going to modify this slide and apparently didn't do a very good job. So, I mean, there's other comics here. There's this one in the center here with modern infrastructure. So if you consider that most modern infrastructure is typically, built on open source at some level, you don't often know that it's there. It could be at some very low level of the stack. But I mean, it's a critical risk as part of your overall infrastructure. And typically, as I mentioned earlier, could be maintained by one open source maintainer of some open source project somewhere in the world. And so when you consider that, you start to realize the risk that consumers face when they're using open source, because they don't quite understand how all of these projects that they're utilizing are actually maintained. And so I think that, there's like a lot of famous sayings when it comes to open source, right? The saying that, open source isn't free as in beer, it's free as in speech, meaning it's all about freedoms. There's also a saying about open source is free as in puppies, meaning that there's a lot of responsibility. I kind of like this quote: open source is free as in toilet. And this is from a maintainer's perspective, meaning that if you're maintaining an open source project, you sort of feel like the cleaner of a public restroom, meaning a lot of people are getting a lot of value from that restroom and it's sort of serving a critical function, but somebody has to clean it. It's not a glamorous job, but that's often how an open source maintainer feels as they, as their project becomes more popular and they have to focus on maintaining it. And so I think that one of the things that tends to happen is I think that most maintainers of open source projects, when they initially release them, they understand that there's sort of these immutable laws around open source, right? Open source is based on freedom, right? That's a fact. By its very nature, freedom reduces leverage and control over the usage of whatever that product is. And so by releasing an open source project under an open source license, the person who created it has made a decision basically to give away their IP for free, right? They're not going to have a lot of control over it. And the users or the consumers of that open source project are not obligated in any way to contribute anything back. They don't have to contribute in the form of volunteering on the project. They don't have to contribute financially. There is nothing in the open source structure that requires any contribution back. And so contributors or maintainers are not entitled to receive anything from users. And I think that as open source projects become more popular and there's more and more of a burden on the maintainers, they start to lose sight of these immutable laws and they start to believe that they deserve more recognition and more support for the efforts that they're putting in, which is obviously contrary to what the original laws are around releasing an open source project. Some of the other myths around open source. So the idea that an open source project has unlimited resources. In theory, that's true. However, as we've already talked about, the vast majority of people just consume open source. They don't contribute back in any way. Another sort of myth that I've encountered a lot is, the idea that, if you just get a few more people to contribute to the project, that'll alleviate some of the burden. The reality is that most open source creators are developers and they have a passion for solving a technical problem. They are not interested in managing other people. And so increasing the number of contributors actually increases the amount of work that they need to do, because instead of being a developer, they need to become a manager and manage and coordinate the work that needs to be done on their open source project. Obviously, that helps to scale the efforts around, the things that need to be done on the project. But fundamentally, that's not how they started. That's not what they were interested in when they created the open source project, right? They didn't want to be a manager. They wanted to contribute value in the form of code. And so that's another myth that often people don't recognize. Some people also feel that open source projects follow different rules than commercial projects. And in fact, that is not the case, right? Open source is still a product. It still is governed or limited by the product market fit that a commercial product would be governed by. The only difference is, of course, you can get your product out into the hands of more users more easily. But that can create other problems like we talked about previously, where those consumers can start demanding a lot more features and support and things of that nature. And I think another fallacy when it comes to open source is that there's sort of this mysterious business model that exists that no one seems to know about, that can solve all the problems when it comes to open source sustainability. And the reality is that is not true. There's many different business models that can be employed to try and solve the sustainability problem when it comes to open source. And it's going to be different for each project, for each maintainer, for each industry, for each geographical area. So there is not one business model that works consistently for everyone. I had a note here because I'm primarily based in the Microsoft ecosystem, but there's thoughts that, of course, that open source sustainability is harder in the Microsoft ecosystem. Based on my experience over time every open source ecosystem, Microsoft or not, suffers from these sustainability challenges. They're the same challenges in all ecosystems. And so like the grass is not greener elsewhere. In some ways, monetization is maybe even a little easier in the Microsoft ecosystem because traditionally, Microsoft has charged for software. And so the users of Microsoft software are more familiar with having to pay license fees. But anyways, again, this is another myth that sometimes is shared in the industry. And then lastly, I think a lot of open source maintainers seem to believe that simply changing a product license is an entire business model, right? So if you're maybe licensed your open source project under, some very liberal, permissive license, and then you tweak that license so that it has more restrictions on it. Some people believe that, oh, now I have a business model, right? And then that should solve all of my sustainability problems. Well, the reality is a product license is only a small part of the overall picture that you need to consider when you're considering dealing with your sustainability problem. I really like this graph. It was borrowed from Rob Mensching, who's the creator of the Wix open source project. But this really emphasizes the fact that when most people think about open source, they really only think about the code, right? The code that's part of the open source project. But as an open source maintainer, you're responsible for a whole lot more than just the code. And this is, obviously a picture of a GitHub repo, but all of these areas that are highlighted in blue are all extra responsibilities beyond the code that a maintainer is responsible for, right? They're responsible for managing the issues and responding to people that report issues. They're responsible for merging pull requests and reviewing pull requests. They're responsible for answering discussion postings. They're responsible for maintaining the release process. They're responsible for security vulnerabilities, right? They're responsible for documentation. Like there's so much more that is involved in maintaining an open source project than just the code itself. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of developers don't realize that when they consider releasing an open source project, right? They're only thinking about, oh, I just got to upload the code to GitHub and I'm good to go. Now that's just the start. And then all of the other responsibilities will come to the forefront soon enough. So definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And this is often how maintainers feel, is like, how much more of this can I take before I will suffer from burnout? And I kind of like this quote. So open source is kind of like consulting, where clients ask you to create brilliant solutions to complicated problems. But in this case, you don't get paid. And I don't know too many consultants that are interested in doing all the work for free. So you can sort of see some of the contrasts between like what maintainers are doing and then what the reality is. So we're going to transition now into talking a bit more about the monetization of open source. And so maintainers would like to be compensated for the work that they do. I think that's sort of universal, right? Like if you've created something of value and you're offering it to the broader community, and you know that it's actually saving people time or helping people generate revenue of their own, then it would be great if they could receive some of the benefit of that themselves monetarily. However, you can't just expect that money starts flowing your way when you release an open source project. And so taking a step back, it's like, what do people actually pay money for? Well, like in the real world, they pay for things that aren't free, right? They pay for products or services which are not available for free, right? If they don't have to pay, then they're not going to pay. If there is a free option, then they'll buy things that are, ancillary, like additional benefits to it, like additional features, support. Third thing is taxes and licenses. So, I mean, taxes, unfortunately, a fact of life for all of us, and that's something that regulatory thing that we, of course, have to pay. Licensing is a compliance construct that also, people have to obey the legal rules, and so they're obligated to pay for licenses. They will also invest money but often that's in this case, it's like for purchasing equities and things of that nature, but they're expecting a return on investment for their investments. And so this isn't generally an option for open source. And then, of course, charitable donations. The problem with charitable donations is they are not a predictable model, right? Because you don't know at any given time who might actually donate to your open source project. And then often, especially larger companies or even individuals, are not inclined to donate often if those donations are not tax deductible. And there's a way, of course, that you have to structure an organization to accept tax deductible donations so that they can be written off on a tax return. And most open source projects, are not going to go down that path. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that people will pay money for, but you've got to try to map those things to your open source project. So investing in the donation model is kind of like the tip jar model. And I know I'm sort of on a Open Source Friday, which is hosted by GitHub. There's obviously some benefit that is provided by GitHub sponsors to some open source projects, but donations in general are not a sustainable revenue model, right? They can generate some revenue for the maintainers, but it's not predictable revenue. It's not something they can count on every month. And I know that there's efforts in this area to help improve GitHub sponsors, but it's not a simple problem to solve. So let's talk a little bit about open source and open for business. In some ways, these concepts may seem contradictory. They may seem like a bit of an oxymoron, but I'm going to explain that in a lot of ways they actually make perfect sense together. That they're very complementary to one another, and they can help solve some of the problems that are sort of fundamental to open source, not just in terms of helping maintainers from a support perspective, but also helping consumers. So commercial open source, sometimes abbreviated as COSS. There's a couple different approaches that I've seen to this. One approach is a very proactive approach where a developer is already thinking about the business model, right, for their open source project before they even release it, right? They're wanting to leverage the benefits of the open source model for getting their product out to a large number of consumers, leveraging the channels for marketing, distribution. Unfortunately, this is kind of a very rare approach. Most developers aren't thinking about this when they create an open source project. What is much more common is this reactive approach, right? Where they create an open source project without any plan about what the business might look like later, or how they might monetize it. They release it, and then they start to wonder what to do next. And I think the big question here is you have to sort of look at an open source project like a business. And would you ever start a business without a business plan? Of course, some people do, but it's generally not a recommended practice. And so open source projects that have no long-term plan or haven't thought about business models or sustainability often become a victim of their own success, right? So if their project takes off, then they're going to be overwhelmed and they have no plan. That is not a good position to be in. I've used this analogy with an automobile to kind of explain some of the different commercial open source models that various companies have used over time to deal with the open source sustainability problem. So of course, on the top left is just traditional open source. So we released an open source project, and in that model, there's really no commercial aspect to it. Oh, and I should probably mention that I have the highway running down the middle of this because any open source project can offer professional services around it or sponsored enhancements around it. But this isn't unique to just the maintainer of the project, of course. This is available to anybody who, even consumers of that open source project, they can offer commercial services around it as well. And so basically in that model, you don't have any specific advantage as the maintainer. You're competing with your ecosystem to provide those professional services around the open source project. Another model is if you have built or architected your open source project in such a way that it allows for extensibility, then you can build commercial extensions that you can sell using a commercial license around your open source project. and those might add extra functionality that users are interested in. And so that's one way that you can help solve the sustainability problem. If your product has extensibility and you're allowing others to take advantage of it as well, so they can build extensions, then you could also host a marketplace, right? Like an app store, where the various extensions or tools that are available for your open source product can be listed, and they can be commercial. And you can also, you can manage that marketplace, and you can obtain, a share of every transaction that's conducted through that marketplace. And so that's another way that you can generate revenue as an open source project. One that's very popular down on the bottom left, dual licensing. And probably not everyone really understands what dual licensing means, but the idea behind dual licensing is if you are the copyright owner of an open source project, right? So you own the source code, you are the copyright owner. Then you have the ability to license that source code however you want. You could license under one license, or you could license it under 100 licenses if you wanted to. Dual licensing generally means that you have a traditional open source license that you offer the product under, and then you also have a commercial license as well. The commercial license offers additional benefits to the consumer, like support or SLAs around the usage of the software. And so then a consumer has the option to choose which license they would like to use the product under. And so this has been a very popular model for commercializing open source projects for many, many years. Open core is similar to dual license and some of these other models. However, it's basically adding additional functionality to the original open source project, bundling all of that together and under a commercial license and offering that as a commercial product. So in this case, it actually has feature differentiation from the original open source project. So in this case, you basically have two products, right? You have a traditional open source project under an open source license, and then you have a commercial project, which is the open source project, but with a bunch of other proprietary extensions that have been bundled with it to increase its value. And last but not least, we have the managed service approach, where you're actually providing the capability, like an environment to actually run the open source project in. This might be, a hosting environment where you provide a hosted version of the software. And of course, then you can generate revenue off of the service that you're providing, right, for the infrastructure. And of course, as part of that, you generally provide support as well. So there's a bunch of different models here. These different models require different levels of investment to, get them off the ground. And some of these are only applicable to certain types of open source projects, right? Not all projects can have an extensibility model where you can, add extra capabilities around them. If it's a very, very specialized and focused library, then that's what its intended purpose is. And it probably can't really easily have an extensibility model. So depending on the type of open source project, will sometimes dictate like some of the commercialization options that you have available. And it's also important to note that most open source projects, if they adopt sort of a commercial model, they'll actually end up adopting multiple approaches as part of their business strategy. So they won't just follow one single commercialization approach, but they'll have multiple approaches to cater to different stakeholders. In this graph, I've tried to kind of break down the evolution of a commercial open source project. And so in terms of life cycle stages, we're starting with sort of the hobby project, the one that's been released and really probably doesn't have any commercial aspirations. If it grows substantially, then it starts to attract a community around it, gets a lot of metrics like downloads, gets a lot of users. It might attract more contributors who are helping out in some capacity. And FTEs are intended to represent the number of people who are full-time committed to maintaining the open source project. So often if it's a community project, there's actually nobody that's full-time committed. Everyone is a volunteer. crossing the threshold to professional is very difficult. And it typically requires a project that has a high level of adoption, because you basically need a very large audience, a very large group of stakeholders who are, committing to your open source project in order to find some that are willing to support it monetarily. And so if you can cross that threshold and get to the professional side, it can be quite valuable from a sustainability perspective. And then, of course, we've got the very, very large open source projects, which I'm classifying as enterprise, but they have massive numbers of downloads, massive numbers of users, and you get into a whole different realm once you get into enterprise. And I've kind of broken down below the life cycle stages and the metrics, the different types of revenue opportunities that are available to an open source project depending on the stage they're at. So if you're at the hobby stage, then you can accept donations. You can put advertising perhaps within the product or on your open source properties. You can accept sponsorships. This might produce some cash flow for you, but it's passive revenue and it's not scalable or predictable. Once you get to the community level and above, you might be able to introduce some professional services because there's enough users of your open source project that might need help with the integration of it, right? So you can start offering professional services, training, perhaps even support at this, and that might be a bit more scalable, but it's very labor intensive, right? You're not necessarily selling a product at this point, you're selling your services, and that does not scale well. So I often see this is a big challenge for maintainers who have an open source project is, they think, oh, I'll just introduce some professional services around the open source project and that'll solve my sustainability problem. And what ends up happening is they end up spending 95% of their time on the professional services to deliver solutions for clients and 5% on the open source project itself, right? So that can also be a challenge. Once you get to the professional and enterprise stage, you can start introducing some of the other more commercial licensed models. Like this typically involves some type of a commercial license, and then you're in fact selling the product, which scales a lot better than selling services. And this can provide cash flow. You can start building equity in your business. The challenge, of course, is like sort of getting to this point and getting it off the ground often requires some kind of startup capital to build out the infrastructure to do it. And then, of course, if you get to the enterprise stage, then you're in a whole different realm. You can probably raise venture capital. And of course, once you do that, the focus is not so much on just sustainability or profitability. It's more about just growth at any cost, right? And that's like once you've reached like the venture funded kind of phase, you're driving towards some kind of an outcome that is much larger than a traditional business. I also on the bottom left here, I've kind of identified some of the success probability factors that open source projects can consider. So, and these aren't like hard and fast rules, of course. These are just a general suggestion, but if your project type is very specialized library, it's much harder to commercialize that than it is something that is a platform. Platforms obviously have extensibility models built into them. They have ways for an ecosystem to be built up around them so that people can participate and also make money off the open source project. So I give that like a plus 20%, right, in terms of the probability of being successful with commercialization. The age of the project also matters a lot. Like you need to have some level of maturity, some level of stability in the open source project for people to be willing to take the risk on it. And so if it's very young, like in the first 1 to 3 years, it's very hard to convert that to being a commercialized project at that stage. You basically haven't established it deeply enough for people to be able to adopt it. So I'd say 3+ years minimum in order to be successful. Market size, I mean, if you're catering to a very small niche market, it's going to be tough for you to be successful in introducing a commercial business model. What you really want is a very large market that your product is applicable to. Similarly, if you segment that market, if your market is primarily in the small to medium-sized business space, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Whereas if you're targeting the enterprise market, of course, enterprise customers are willing to pay money for solutions that solve large problems. So your chance of success will be higher. And then competition. So if there's a ton of players in the space already, especially other open source players as well, it's going to be more challenging. Whereas if there's not a lot of competition, of course, you're going to have a much higher chance of success. However, I do have an asterisk next to this, because it is often very helpful for an open source project to have at least one major enterprise commercial competitor in the space, because that provides sort of validation that there's a real problem that people are willing to spend money on. And you can introduce your open source project and you can kind of sell your commercial version underneath that enterprise product. A lot of open source projects have done that successfully over time. And that has produced some pretty decent outcomes for those open source projects. So one of the fundamentals of open source is licensing. And I think the definitive source for open source licensing is the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, which has been around for a long time. And it has, the open source, it maintains the open source definition. And the open source definition has a whole list of criteria that an open source license needs to adhere to in order to be considered open source. There's primarily two types of open source licenses. There's permissive licenses, which have very few restrictions on the usage. And then there's non-permissive, sometimes called copyleft, which have more usage restrictions around them. And so this is very important. As an open source, like a creator of an open source project, you need to understand licensing. Because often the license that you choose when you initially release your open source project is going to be the license that you get stuck with for a period of time. And if it was the wrong choice, then it's going to have certain side effects on the growth of your open source project, the adoption, and even the monetization model. But one thing to keep in mind when it comes to open source licenses, and we're looking at the MIT license here, which is, it's one of the permissive open source licenses. This license in particular is very simple. And so if we look at this, it basically describes, who has the right to change or define the terms of usage, right? That's the copyright holder, which I mentioned earlier. So that's who basically owns the open source project. Then it describes like the freedoms that it offers. It also indicates in this particular case that you can't claim that you wrote the software yourself. You have to provide attribution back to the original creator of the software. That's fine. And then you get down to this last clause. And this clause is pretty typical in most open source licenses, which basically says you are using this software at your own risk, right? Most open source projects have this type, or licenses have this kind of a clause in it. And so as an organization or a consumer that's utilizing an open source project, I think that you probably realize that you are using that software at your own risk. But I find that a lot of people don't treat it that way. They expect it to provide the same level of service and warranty and guarantees that commercial software provides. But the open source license explicitly says that it doesn't provide those things, right? You are using it at your own risk. And another type of license that's become, I think, more popular more recently, but this is really much at the larger sort of enterprise open source level, is a source available license, where people have the right to do certain things with the source code, but it has limitations on how it can be used. Typically, the very large open source projects are concerned about some of the very large service providers in the industry, like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, others, right? Basically utilizing their open source projects, creating a service offering around them, and selling those projects, and not providing a whole lot of support back to the original open source maintainers. And so a business source license was intended to address that problem. And you can see some of the projects here that utilize this approach: HashiCorp, MongoDB, Redis Labs. These are all like very, very large, widely adopted open source projects, often with venture backing, or are like public companies now. And so But I think the important thing to note about the business source license is that it's not open source, right? It doesn't, these licenses don't adhere to the open source definition. So they're in fact not open source licenses. The people who are using these BSL licenses can say they're open source because they do offer access to source code and they do offer some freedoms, but they are not, like, they don't follow the open source definition. And so transitioning now over to the consumer side of things. So there's some laws around consumers of open source. So one of the laws is, I mean, when you use open source software as a consumer, you're taking a dependency on something which you have no control over. And I guess that's true for commercial open source, or sorry, commercial products as well, because you don't have any direct control over that product, but you do have a business relationship, right? You have a formal business relationship with the company that's providing that commercial product. In open source, you have no formal business relationship. Also, free usage means that you're not entitled to any support, maintenance, or enhancement. So you're not entitled to anything by utilizing the open source project. And maintainers of the open source project, so the copyright holder, has the right to change the open source license to a different license at any time that they want, right? They own the product. They have the right to change it and relicense it however they see fit. So as a consumer, these are the things that you need to be aware of. And so as a consumer, what you're really trying to mitigate all the time are risks. And so there are risks, of course, around using open source software that you might be interested in mitigating. The risks with using open source software, there is a great number of them that have been documented over time. They provide great benefit, but of course there is some risk as well. One thing in particular that's become more talked about in recent years is software supply chain management, right? So if you are building a solution and you're using a variety of different products as part of that solution, including open source projects, you should really understand the licensing model around those projects. You should understand how they're maintained, who is maintaining them, how they are sustaining themselves, because if every single one of those dependencies that you have is a potential point of failure. And if any one of them, fails in some way, then your overall solution is going to be impacted. And we've seen that with, for example, security vulnerabilities with open source projects that are very widely adopted, right? That created a great deal of panic across all of the different consumers of that open source project. So that's, a real challenge in terms of maintaining your supply chain for your solutions that you're providing. So the one thing that commercial open source can do is that it can provide benefits that mitigate some of these risks that we've just talked about. So a commercial open source product, can provide a traditional commercial license. And that provides a actual formal business relationship between the creator of that open source project and an individual company. Basically, a throat to choke. Basically, if something goes wrong, they have somebody to reach out to so that they can get their problem mitigated. There's a whole lot of additional benefits that commercial open source projects can provide, such as, a more tested or certified build. They can, take more responsibility for managing the dependencies. They can provide support. They can provide documentation. They can provide a knowledge base, security updates, indemnification, which is a big one as well. So that basically, there's no legal liability that people are taking on by utilizing an open source project. So there's a whole lot of things that commercial open source projects can provide. And all of these things are mitigating some of the risks of the things that are not traditionally provided as part of a traditional open source project. As part of this journey to commercialize your open source project, you're going to encounter sort of a community segmentation, meaning you're going to have a large number of users that are using the open source project, but then you're going to have a new set of stakeholders. You're going to have customers, people that are paying you money for the services that you're providing. And you might provide a slightly prioritized, communication channel, or additional benefits to those customers. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having community segmentation. The users of the open source project that are not paying may not be happy with it, but in order to sustain the open source project, somebody has to pay. And if they're not willing to, then they should be willing to accept the fact that maybe some other stakeholders are going to get preferential treatment that they're not getting. Transitioning an open source project, though, to become more commercial has some challenges around it. And that is around the business operations side. Obviously, you are going to have to treat your open source project more as a real company. Right? You're going to have to actually set up a commercial entity and register the company. And you're going to have to worry about things like insurance and trademarks. And you're going to have to come up with some kind of a pricing model. You're going to have to come up with a license agreement that basically exemplifies the type of commercial license you want to provide. You probably want to provide license enforcement too in the product so that people have to adhere to that license agreement. You may want to track the actual usage of the product more granularly. You're going to have to do traditional marketing. You're going to have to do traditional sales. You're going to have to provide a way for people to purchase the product, and you're going to have to be able to provide support. And all of these things are additional like infrastructure and services that you're not used to providing in a normal like standard open source project. And it takes some effort to put these in place and get them off the ground. And when an open source maintainer starts to look at the list of things here, this can be overwhelming as well, right? So just getting over the hump to be able to commercialize is sometimes a real challenge for an open source maintainer. Another thing to be aware of is the market size and conversion. So I think it's important for open source maintainers to not fool themselves into thinking that, you know, you can basically do a quick math formula based on the number of downloads of your, say, of your open source project on one of the popular repositories and back into some kind of a number when it comes to commercial licenses that might be sold. The actual conversion ratio of open source projects to commercial licenses is very, very small. Like I've heard a lot of people say, oh, you should be able to get 1%. That is not my experience. It's going to be way, way below 1%. In the original .NET Nuke project, when we commercialized, we had about 8 million downloads of the project. And we were able to track some aspects of usage. So we knew we had about 800,000 installations worldwide of that software. We ultimately sold 4,000 licenses. So we had a 0.05% conversion ratio. Of course, when we raised venture capital, we thought we could do a lot better than that. But these are some of the realities. So don't fool yourself into believing the vanity metrics that you have for in terms of downloads or other things. Your conversion ratios are going to be much smaller than you think. So we've talked a bit about business model, and the challenge is achieving sort of the right balance. So when you introduce a commercial model within your open source project, you've got to realize that the open source project is still the engine that is driving the entire thing. And so if you add too many restrictions to the open source project, or if you piss off the stakeholders that are using the open source project too much, you're gonna break the engine, right? And if you break the engine, then the commercialization is going to be all for naught, right? You're not going to have a sustainable model going forward because you're not going to have the new users coming on board to use the project. So the best you can do in that scenario is just convert the existing users, and that's not a good model. So you've got to try to achieve sort of the right balance, right? And of course, you're going to have to go through some real challenging times. Typically, when an open source maintainer or project introduces commercialization, the community wants to lynch them initially, right? They are not happy that there's any change, right? Like, why would you change anything? Everything is working fine from my perspective. And so the messaging is super important. And what I've seen, unfortunately, is usually what happens is an open source maintainer is so burned out and so frustrated that they're quite emotional when they make this decision. And the initial messaging is focused all about them. Like, I'm suffering, I'm a victim, I need to save my open source project, so I need to introduce an open source model, or sorry, a commercial model. That is not the most positive messaging that you could provide to a community. What is much more positive from a messaging perspective is, hey, there's a group of stakeholders in our community that are demanding commercial support, right? They want extra benefits. And so I'm introducing an open or a commercial model to cater to those stakeholders. It's going to strengthen the open source project by providing extra things like documentation and additional capabilities over time. You spin it, it's a positive message, and you're not even spinning it. It is a fact that by introducing commercialization to an open source project, it is going to improve the project, and it's going to just provide a lot of benefit. And so, like I said, messaging is super important. And before you sort of start talking about commercialization, you need to think about what the message is that you're putting across. The path to open source sustainability is very challenging. There is no doubt. There is no secret recipe. There's no formula. Right? There's a lot of different options that are available, but you've got to choose the one that best suits your specific project and your specific needs. So, getting to the end of this, who pays for open source? Like I said, this is a rhetorical question. Maintainers pay for open source with the blood, sweat, and tears that they put in their projects. Consumers pay for open source with the risk that something could go wrong with the open source project that they depend on. And if an open source project provides commercialization capabilities, then consumers can also pay with actual money to help support the open source project, which can produce a sustainable model going forward. And that is my presentation. I hope that there was a lot of interesting stuff that perhaps you learned, and so both from maintainers and consumers' perspective, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That was incredible, Shaun. It's so comprehensive. I think some of the questions that I originally thought I definitely wanted to touch on, you cover. Like, I really wanted to understand the licensing, that thought process behind licensing when you're approaching open source as a business. It's completely different. And I love that you mentioned that one's got to be very thoughtful when you are considering what license to set your project up. There's a ton of confusion in that. I need to find some resources to share with the audience. I think yesterday we might have had a talk that it was actually touching into that very specific topic. But that's just super comprehensive. I'm going to scroll to the chat to take a look and see if I have any questions. But I think most people are like me. Like, you literally answer all the questions that I wanted to ask you. There was something originally, maybe, and I think this might have been more a question about your own personal experience, because obviously you've been there, done that. You created a business, and now, of course, you're the creator of the project. But let me just kind of scroll up and find this question. First, I wanted to make sure that I touched on that. And then I think while I do that, while I find
maybe
this
isn't
somehow.
Yeah, so maybe this isn't an actual question that was asked, but one thing, so for those projects that are quite widely adopted and more successful, and maybe you're considering raising venture capital, because I went down that path. I didn't really talk much about that in my presentation. The one thing that I found challenging going through that process was that if you haven't done a good job of maintaining records of all of the different people who have contributed to your open source project, it can be more challenging. And so you typically want to have a CLA, so a contributor license agreement for your open source project, so anyone who makes a contribution, it's clear that they have the rights to this code that they're contributing. You know who contributed, you know where it came from, and often it's also transferring the rights for that code to the copyright holder of the open source project, so that they basically can manage the entire project and not think of it as a whole, patchwork quilt of a whole bunch of contributions. But once you get to raising venture capital, the investors are going to say, hey, do you have the rights to all of the source code of your project? With .NET Nuke, we actually did not. And so we had to go back to every contributor and have them sign a contributor license agreement. There was 40 different people. And it's sometimes even hard to find the people years later. So that's something to consider if you're actually thinking of going down that path.
Interesting. And so was the issue because it wasn't explicitly addressed as part of the licensing or contribution guidelines, or like how can we better prepare to do that? So the answer is to have this agreement beforehand, and that's a
Right.
separate. That's a separate. Is it
Yeah.
a legal document? How do you get people to do that? I've never
Yeah.
heard this before. This is
So within the .NET Foundation, we actually have a CLA bot, it's called, and so any contribution that's made to a project within the .NET Foundation, it's actually the service is an integrated part of the GitHub experience for them. It basically requires them to accept the terms of the contributor license agreement, and it basically transfers the source, or basically ensures that the source code, they have the rights to be able to contribute it. And then you have a record of it as well. But a lot of open source projects that get started don't have an automated way to do it. And in that case, you'd have to rely on, I guess, more traditional methods of,
right.
sending someone a CLA agreement and having them sign it, maybe digitally or otherwise. But yeah, you basically have to have clear records on where all the code came from.
Wow. So I actually just taking a look. I was looking for the CLI bot, and it looks like there is actually a project that is a GitHub app, and it's for that. It adds that automation to your project. So I'm sharing that on the chat now. This is super interesting.
Okay.
I never actually considered the legal implications of that. Actually, I can share my screen so we can take a quick look at it together. And Shaun, I am so sorry. I am taking well over the time. Me and my
That's
life,
okay.
it'll be an hour. But if you have a moment, I think this might be super interesting to just take a quick look at together. And then I do have a couple of questions in the audience. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can take a look here. But this is it's a GitHub app, and it looks like it's in the GitHub marketplace. So you can just go ahead and integrate it. And looks like there is several projects that are already using it. Shout out to Colin Everheard, because I did not even know this was a thing that,
Yeah,
and
I
to
think
you
there's a
for
few
bringing this
different
to attention.
options. Yeah, but
Yeah, that's
this
amazing.
is a useful, very useful, because if it's an integrated part of the workflow, it's much easier for developers to deal with.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And then we had a couple of comments in the chat. Definitely, thank you for calling out burnout. That's something that is not talked about enough, and it can happen at all stages. And if you're new to open source contributions or even being in this ecosystem, sometimes you don't even know what's happening, right? But the thing that used to bring you joy, you're now like, I just freaking hate it. So
Yep.
it's kind of hard to identify. So it's a conversation that needs to be had, and a great open source project lead will keep that top of mind. Then there's a message from Carnegie. I guess, I don't know, this is a friend of yours, someone that knows you from the Charlotte, North Carolina developer group. I love this. I love this. That's amazing. So shout out to your previous acquaintances for dropping by. And then there's a question about open source projects and sustainability. And this is this is a question that we can spend a whole other hour chatting on.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
how can open
transparency is
source
probably the
projects?
answer. Yeah, transparency is the
Yes,
answer to this one, but also focusing on the positives, like I was trying to say with the soapbox slide there.
yes.
By introducing commercialization, you're not trying to negatively affect the original users or developers of the project, right? You're trying to provide sustainability and improve the project in many ways. And so if you message that correctly, um, you can continue to maintain the trust. But yeah, openness, transparency is the key.
100%. I think the worst thing that you can do is do that rug pull move that some folks have done, where it's like you're kind of doing a
Yeah.
swapperoo on the community, and
Yeah,
that is
I
a bad
completely
idea.
understand why people do that too, because they're so frustrated that
That's
they
fair.
just make a decision in the spur of the moment and type up their message and say, "I'm done," right? Like, and it feels like a
Never
rug pull, but
mind.
it came from a place of like such frustration, right? That you kind of, well, I guess you'd have to be a maintainer to understand that mindset. It's
Oh,
not wise to do it,
100%.
but yeah.
Yeah. So important to have all of these things, to think through all of this before and follow these practices. And listen, folks, we like stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like people like Shaun have been doing this for many years. You're just giving us an incredibly comprehensive presentation about what's work, your feelings about things, licensing, and I think it's a good reference for folks who are considering coming in. So transparency key here. This percentage money back. Ricardo, first of all, you're my favorite person because you are thinking about money. And I love that. And money for sustainability. So what contribution should you give back, or how do you think about the percentages when you're assessing, like, if my project depends on XYZ project?
Yeah,
What's a
this
good
this
way
is
to
a
think about that?
this is a complicated one because it's like the slide, which, with all the building blocks on top of each other. So,
Hmm.
there's open source projects that are higher in the value chain and closer to the customer, right? And it'll be easier for those folks to solicit monetary contributions because they have direct access. They might be using a whole lot of open source projects as well that are kind of hidden in the infrastructure layer. And I guess the responsibility would be then be on the higher level open source project in the chain to share some of the wealth downwards. I don't know if that happens very often. Um, that is a challenging problem. I mean,
Absolutely.
there's no set rule around what percentage. I think yeah, it would also depend on, you know, how much monetary support is needed to support the higher level project, right? If it requires them to hire support people and like writers to do documentation, and pretty soon the money's gone and there's no money to share downwards. Like so it's because you're running a business at that point, and you're going to have to
Hmm.
make decisions that relate to how your business operates.
Yeah, that's very fair. So I guess it's an individual assessment, individual to your project and the projects your project depend on. But thank you for having your heart in the right place and thinking about how you can
Yeah,
contribute back. That's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
That's amazing. All right, let's take one more. There is some really interesting questions here. Rick, wow, this is a really loaded one. Continuity risk. We encounter companies that really like our open source data solutions, but are reluctant to start using our solutions as our maintainer base is really small. Um, Being open source felt to them as a proper answer, but it doesn't seem to be sufficient.
Yeah, so I think that probably the people who are looking to adopt that solution, they're looking for the traditional insurance and security that they get from commercial vendors, right? So they're
Hmm.
looking for a SLA or a support contract or an official relationship. If something goes wrong, can they reach out to somebody directly and have their problem addressed immediately? Do they have a private channel to talk to you about their problems? These are all of the things that a commercial open source like model can offer that can't be offered in a just a standard open source project. So maybe that's the solution, and that's what I was trying to get at with my presentation. Is like commercial open source is not a bad word, right? It provides benefits to a certain group of stakeholders that are looking for those services that can't get them currently.
Yeah, absolutely. So ask for money, charge for it. And then, with that
Yeah,
maybe top of mind, and that gives it's interesting how it's such a fallacy, because I've been having this conversation a lot recently about reference conferences. People cannot understand how something that is free brings so much value. And it's a harder sell. I can tell you, no, this conference is $3,000 a ticket. So when you look at sponsorship of that conference, you think, wow, of course, I'm going to give you 100K for it. But if I tell you it's a free conference because, it's a community driven and there are big companies that are sponsored, you're having a harder time understanding the value. And I think there is
yeah,
a similar sort of thought process going on here. Like, well,
yeah.
you just gotta
Well,
charge
and
for it, I guess.
there's a skepticism, right? We've been taught to follow the money, right? Follow the
Yeah,
money
yeah.
and everything will make sense. And in open source, you follow the money and there is no money. And you're like, how can this work?
I'm going to clip this very moment and this is going to be a short. And in open source, you follow the money, and then there is no money. That's brilliant, Shaun. Wow. Wow. And then finally, and this is, I think we need the soapbox. And then what we need to do is the next time that we meet, and I'm super psyched that maybe we'll get to meet soon, but definitely love to meet you later in universe and all these things. Because I think that this is a good soapbox for both of us to stand on and have a nice conversation about it. Angelo, should companies call open something change their name to close something?
Geez, I know where this is going. um, this is a loaded question as well.
It is a lot of
So
question, and I'm sorry. I
yeah,
should not ambush you.
no, it's okay.
But
Because like
it's opinions. It's
I
opinions,
think it's
and
so companies that have like at least a open source heritage, right, often choose
I
like
like
an
that.
open type of brand. And as long as they continue to exemplify some open qualities, I don't see a problem with it. And I wouldn't say they have to change their name. Um, but it becomes, unfortunately, like if it just becomes a marketing term, I think the community itself will start to recognize that, and they might, they'll be judged on their actions.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I think I agree with you. As long as you're keeping some of those values, it's a continuous evolution, friends, and it changes. But Angelo, thank you for that. He said it was a joke, but hey, we we can see we see through the pain through the laughter. We see it.
Yeah.
We see it. Shaun, this has been fantastic. I'm sharing on screen right now your X account. And then, of course, I'm going to share your website, and I'll add to these notes of this is being recorded, and it's going to be forever in our YouTube channel. So it'll be part of the Open Source Friday playlist. If you want to go back, share it. And of course, if you're watching in any of the other channels, you'll be able to see it for the amount of time that they allow this content to stay. But for sure, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any of this content. It's been fantastic to have you. Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation. I've learned a lot today. I think folks really appreciated the candor and humor. You had some of my favorite memes in your presentation. So that's always great. Those cartoons are awesome. We'll have to have you come back. And I hope that we get a chance to meet soon. And thank you again for everything you're doing for open source. And I feel like you're doing the best part of paying it forward, as sharing the knowledge, and your battle wounded and proven tested from so many years of experience. Like, that's just absolutely invaluable.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
And yeah, trying to share the realities instead of like
it's not always flowers.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. We appreciate that 100%. So thank you for being here, and we can't wait to see you again.
Thank you.
Folks, how was that? That was an incredible presentation. I am so super excited that you were able to spend the time here with us. I love it when we get people that are just so incredible in their field to come and share their knowledge. And this today was just fantastic. So many nuggets, so many golden nuggets were touched on. If you're thinking about creating a commercial solution for an open source project, remember all the things that Shaun shared. Go back and read more about licensing, learn about the CLA bot. This was brand new to me today. So good opportunity for all of us to up level and share the knowledge. If you are interested in all the other activities for Maintainer Month, please go by our website. This website is an open source project itself. And folks, this is the power of open source. We started sharing this project as part of our live streams that we do on Thursdays. And now the communities come together and being awesome. And this is the best this website has ever looked. Now it has like a scheduling that is a lot more user-friendly. The responsiveness of the design. It's a Next.js website. It's nothing out of this world. But please, if you feel like you want to contribute to an open source project, come by our website and take a look and see. But basically, in this site, you get to take a look at not only all the events that are scheduled during open source Maintainer Month, which there is plenty. We're going to have another stream today at 1 p.m. where we're having the folks from, let me make sure I'm not completely lying to you, who's going to be here, comebacks. So make sure you come by and check it out. And then you can also take advantage of our partner pack, which is a new thing. I don't know, you might have missed the announcement. So this is a spotlight on the people who power open source, and there is a ton of goodies here. So most of you might be familiar with Student Developer Pack, but this is a different level, and it's for all of you. So definitely go by, take advantage of these freebies for your projects. Take advantage, take advantage. And there is also a security challenge, because that is such an important topic. I think there were mentions of security throughout the presentation, and it's something that it concerns all of us. So you can now earn a free certification, and all you have to do is come to this page, complete the skills, and I believe you're getting a voucher. Yeah, you get if you finish all of this content, which this is not super long and boring content. It's actually very to the point. You have an opportunity to get a free certification exam voucher. So you can get that for free. So lots and lots of goodies for Maintainer Month. Thank you so much to the open source team. Kara, Abby, you're absolutely killing it. This has been the best Maintainer Month yet. So thank you for being here and putting up all this great stuff for our community. All right, folks, I hope to see y'all a little later. My colleague Kadesha is going to be joined by the Convex team. So I'm going to leave you with a short clip of that so that you can scan that QR code and be sure to join us. You get like an hour and a half break, and then you can come right back. If you enjoy this presentation, please share it in social media. Please share it using the hashtag Maintainer Month. And don't forget to follow Shaun. I mean, it's just incredible. Like, amazing. All right, my friends. I will see you next time. I think the next time I will see you will be on next Friday for another Open Source Friday. Thank you all so much again for being here, and thank you for your support of open source. And Wayne, yes, I am going to drop these links on the chat, and I apologize to my LinkedIn friends, because the production I have to do it manually. So I'm coming back, Wayne. I'm on LinkedIn now, and I posted it there as well. And I'll share the next LinkedIn. Thank you so much for being here, your support of open source, and we'll see you next week.